Some angels call at 3 a.m. When Jim Carrey walked onto the Tonight Show stage with that enigmatic smile and philosophical demeanor that had made him one of Hollywood's most complex figures, nobody expected him to reveal the most heartbreaking secret of his post-comedy career. Jimmy Fallon had planned a thoughtful interview about Jim's latest art project and spiritual journey. The audience was ready for the deep insights and existential humor that always came with a Jim Carrey appearance, but what Jim was about to confess would silence Studio 6B and prove that sometimes the most important performances happen over the phone in the middle of the night when someone's life hangs in the balance. The cameras were rolling, the audience was already captivated by Jim's magnetic presence, and then he spoke 12 words that changed everything. When fans write saying goodbye forever, I call them at 3 a.m. What came next wasn't just television, it was a revelation about darkness, hope, and the sacred responsibility that comes with being someone's last reason to stay alive. Jim Carrey had always been known for his transformative ability to become other people. The rubber-faced comedian who could morph into any character, the dramatic actor who could disappear completely into roles. But what audiences didn't know was that Jim's greatest transformation had been learning to become himself, and that journey through his own darkness had awakened a calling to help others find their way back from the edge. The midnight phone calls had begun 3 years earlier, during Jim's own battle with depression and existential crisis that had followed his massive career success. After publicly sharing his struggles with mental health and the philosophical awakening that had helped him survive his darkest period, Jim began receiving fan mail that was unlike anything he had experienced during his comedy career. The letters changed completely after I started talking about depression, Jim later explained. Instead of people asking for autographs or selfies, I was getting these raw, desperate messages from people who were planning to end their lives and wanted to tell someone who might understand what that darkness felt like. The first call had come in response to a letter from 23-year-old Sarah Chen, a college student in Oregon, who had written to tell Jim that his openness about mental health had made her feel less alone, but that she had already decided to end her life and was writing to say goodbye to someone who had brought her laughter during happier times. Sarah's letter was so specific about her plans, so final in its tone, that I couldn't just write back, Jim remembered. I found her phone number through social media and called her at 2:47 a.m. Pacific time, not knowing if she was even still alive. That first conversation had lasted 4 hours. Jim had talked to Sarah about his own suicide ideation, about the philosophical insights that had helped him reframe his understanding of suffering, and most importantly, about the possibility that her current pain was not permanent, that there were experiences and connections waiting for her that she couldn't imagine from her current perspective. I didn't try to fix her or give her therapy, Jim explained. I just shared my own experience of being in that dark place and finding my way out. I told her about the moment I realized that even my darkest thoughts were just thoughts, not reality, not truth about what was possible. Sarah had agreed to seek professional help that night, and 6 months later, she had written to Jim again, not to say goodbye, but to say thank you. She was in therapy, back in school, and had found ways to manage her depression that allowed her to imagine a future she wanted to live toward. That success had inspired Jim to develop an informal system for responding to suicidal fan mail with direct intervention, working with mental health professionals to ensure he was providing appropriate support rather than potentially harmful amateur counseling. Jim began making personal phone calls to fans who seemed to be in immediate danger of self-harm. I learned that sometimes the difference between someone living or dying is just knowing that one person in the world sees them, really sees them, and believes their life has value. Jim said, "When you're famous, people think your attention doesn't matter because they assume everyone wants it. But for someone who's convinced they're worthless, having anyone, even a stranger, call them at 3 a.m. to say, 'Your life matters to me,' can be the interruption that saves them." Over 3 years, Jim's midnight interventions had reached 43 people in crisis, ranging from teenagers dealing with bullying and family trauma to adults facing job loss, relationship endings, and chronic mental illness. Each call was different, tailored to the specific person's situation and needs, but all of them shared Jim's commitment to meeting people in their darkness without trying to immediately drag them into the light. I never tell people to just think positive or things will get better, Jim explained. When you're suicidal, those platitudes feel insulting because they minimize the reality of your pain. Instead, I acknowledge that their suffering is real and valid, and I share how I learned to find meaning even in the midst of my darkest experiences. The calls weren't brief crisis hotline interactions. They were lengthy, deep conversations where Jim would share his own journey through depression, his philosophical explorations of consciousness and suffering, and practical techniques he had learned for managing overwhelming emotional states. Many calls lasted several hours, with Jim staying on the line until the person felt stable enough to seek professional help or until emergency services could reach them. I talked to a 38-year-old man named David who had lost his job, his house, and his family. In the span of 6 months, Jim remembered, he was sitting in his car with a bottle of pills, ready to end everything. We talked for 5 hours about the illusion of identity, about how the things we think define us are just temporary experiences, about how his current story wasn't his complete story. The emotional impact on Jim had been significant. Taking responsibility for people's lives in their most vulnerable moments had forced him to maintain his own mental health practices rigorously and had deepened his understanding of the philosophical and spiritual insights that had helped him survive his own dark period. These calls keep me honest about my own recovery, Jim reflected. When someone else's life depends on your ability to articulate hope, you can't fake it or rely on empty spiritual bypassing. You have to have done the real work of understanding your own darkness and finding authentic ways through it. Jim kept detailed notes about each person he had called, tracking their recovery progress when they maintained contact and holding space for those who chose to stay private about their healing journey. His records included follow-up information like Marcus, age 19, bullying-related suicide attempt, now in college studying psychology, wants to help other LGBTQ teens. Or Jennifer, 42, postpartum depression crisis, received treatment, back home with family, sends updates about her daughter's milestones. The work had remained completely private until a mental health advocate had mentioned Jim's interventions during a conference about celebrity involvement in suicide prevention. But Jim had been adamant about keeping the specific details confidential, never exploiting the vulnerable people who had trusted him with their darkest moments. Tonight's appearance on The Tonight Show was supposed to focus on Jim's latest art exhibition, which explored themes of consciousness, identity, and transformation. Jimmy had planned to discuss Jim's spiritual journey, maybe explore his philosophical insights, definitely tap into the profound wisdom that had emerged from his personal struggles. But something about the art's themes of finding light in darkness had made Jim more reflective than usual about his most private work. The interview had started with Jim's characteristic depth and insight. He had discussed his art with the kind of philosophical eloquence that had become his trademark, sharing observations about consciousness and creativity that had the audience hanging on every word. Jimmy had asked about his spiritual practices, his artistic process, his journey from comedy to deeper forms of expression, but when Jimmy mentioned the fan mail that Jim must receive from people inspired by his openness about mental health, something shifted in Jim's expression. The question had been meant as a transition to discussing the impact of vulnerability in public life, but it had touched on something much more immediate and personal than Jim usually shared. "You know, Jimmy," Jim said, his voice taking on an unusual gravity, "the mail I get now is very different from what I used to receive. People don't write to ask for laughs anymore. They write to ask for reasons to stay alive." The audience grew quiet, sensing that Jim was moving into territory that was more serious than his usual philosophical observations. That must be heavy to carry, Jimmy said, genuinely moved by Jim's honesty. Jim was quiet for a long moment, his usual animated energy replaced by profound stillness. It's the most important mail I've ever received, because when someone writes to tell you they're planning to end their life and they trust you with that information, you can't just send back an autographed photo. The studio was completely focused on Jim's words now, the energy shifting from intellectual curiosity to emotional intensity. "What do you do with letters like that?" Jimmy asked softly. Jim's eyes filled with tears, a sight that was always powerful when it came from someone who had brought so much joy to others but had struggled so deeply with his own pain. "I call them, at whatever time they need me to call them, 3 a.m., 4 a.m., whenever someone needs to hear that their life has value." The audience fell completely silent, witnessing a side of Jim Carrey that transcended both his comedy and his spiritual teachings, the raw humanity of someone who had survived his own darkness and was using that survival to save others. "Jimmy, can I tell you about something I've been doing for the past 3 years?" Jim asked, his voice growing stronger despite his tears. "Something that's become the most important work of my life?" "Please," Jimmy replied, clearly understanding that something profound was being shared. Jim took a deep breath and spoke directly to the camera. "When people write to tell me they're going to kill themselves, I call them. 43 calls over 3 years, talking people through their darkest moments until they choose to stay alive." Jimmy's expression changed completely as he grasped what Jim was describing. "Jim, you're doing suicide intervention calls personally?" "I'm sharing my experience of being in that dark place and finding my way out," Jim replied gently. "Not as therapy, not as someone who has all the answers, but as someone who understands what it feels like when death seems like the only escape from psychological pain." Tears were streaming down Jimmy's face. "Can you tell us about one of these calls?" "Sarah was my first," Jim said, his voice becoming tender. 23 years old, college student, had written what she called her goodbye letter to me because my comedy had been important to her before she got sick. She had pills, she had a plan, she was ready to die that night. Jim paused, gathering himself to continue. "I called her at almost 3 a.m. and we talked until sunrise. I told her about my own suicide ideation, about the philosophical insights that helped me understand that even my darkest thoughts were just thoughts, not ultimate truth about what was possible." "What happened to Sarah?" Jimmy asked through his tears. "Sarah got help that night," Jim said with obvious relief. "She's been in therapy for 3 years now, just graduated college, and she volunteers with a suicide prevention organization. She says that call taught her that her pain was real and valid, but temporary, and that there were experiences waiting for her that she couldn't imagine from that dark place." The audience was openly emotional, many people crying as they witnessed this revelation about Jim's private ministry to people in crisis. "Jim, how do you handle the responsibility of someone else's life in your hands?" Jimmy asked. "By remembering that I'm not responsible for saving them," Jim replied with hard-won wisdom. "I'm just responsible for showing up authentically and sharing what I've learned. Each person has to make their own choice, but sometimes they just need to know that someone sees them, really sees them, and believes their life has value." As the segment concluded, something unprecedented happened. The entire studio audience rose in sustained applause that lasted over 4 minutes. But it wasn't celebration, it was recognition of something sacred, acknowledgement that they had witnessed real heroism happening in the hidden spaces of private pain. Jim's revelation became one of the most shared Tonight Show segments in the program's history, inspiring conversations about suicide prevention, the responsibility of public figures, and the power of authentic connection in mental health crisis intervention. Most importantly, Jim's disclosure had shown that sometimes the most transformative work happens not on movie screens or stages, but in the intimate darkness of midnight phone calls where one person's survival story becomes another person's reason to choose life.